Hi, my name is Elise. At my sister's engagement party, I didn't arrive late because of traffic. I arrived late because I needed to. Sometimes delay is armor. It buys you one more minute of quiet before stepping into a storm you didn't create. The sun was sinking over the water when I pulled into the gravel lot. Lanterns swayed on the patio, jazz hummed through the speakers, and every detail gleamed as though curated for a glossy magazine spread. Guests in silk dresses and pressed suits clinked glasses of champagne. But nothing there was meant for me. At the check-in table, the hostess slid a badge toward me. It read only one word, Elise. No last name. No title. Below it, guest. Not family, not sister, not daughter, just guest. I wanted to laugh, but my throat burned. I pinned it to my blazer anyway, as though wearing their erasure made it less humiliating. Then I walked into the garden past white hydrangeas and golden ribbon toward a table tucked so far back it felt like exile. Table 12. My companions, strangers, a florist, a coach, a couple who mispronounced my sister's name all evening. I kept my mouth shut because silence has always been my only way to survive in this family. They noticed silence more than they noticed noise. Then came the toast. My sister stood under the chandelier, her gown glimmering like cut glass. She thanked our parents, her parents, she called them, for raising their only daughter. The words hit me like a blade, dull from overuse, but still sharp enough to cut. Forks paused midair. Guests whispered. Some frowned, confused, as if trying to recall if there had ever been another daughter. I sat frozen, not because I wasn't hurt, but because I had already been sliced open so many times I'd stopped bleeding in public. I thought that humiliation was the worst of it. It wasn't. Later near the pergola bar, I noticed a briefcase left on a table. Its flap hung open and a folder peeked out Caldwell Trust Holdings. Cape Cod Transfer Authorization. I knew that font. I used it myself years ago when I was still the family's bookkeeper. I leaned closer. My name stared back at me, typed neat centered above a forged signature. Mine. The A curled wrong. The D looped too wide. Whoever signed it thought they were clever. But they forgot muscle memory can't be faked. I felt my breath slow. Proof, cold and undeniable. From that moment, the party changed. The wine was still poured, the jazz still played, but I was no longer just the erased sister. I was a witness. When the slideshow began, baby photos, ballet recitals, charity galas, I recognized every frame, because I had made it. Years ago, I edited those tapes, crafted the transitions, balanced the music. My mother once told me it was too personal to share. Yet here it was, paraded as my sister's vision. Applause swelled. Guests stabbed tears. I stood at the back, invisible, but holding the truth like a stone in my pocket. Then the screen glitched. For a moment, just a second, an uncropped photo slipped through. There I was, standing mid-laugh at a summer picnic straw hat, tilted sunlight on my face. Whole. Present. The crowd murmured. Someone whispered, "Wasn't she edited out of that version?" Another nodded. "That's the original." The illusion cracked. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to beg. I simply handed an envelope to my sister's fiancé's uncle, the man who handled legal matters. Red, thick, labeled "Trust Irregularities, Supporting Documents Enclosed." My hands didn't shake. Minutes later, he stood ring in hand and spoke words louder than any scream. This marriage would have been built on silence, on erasure. I won't build my future on that. He placed the ring on the table and walked out. No one clapped. No one gasped. The silence itself was judgment. I left the party quietly. At the stone gate, I set my badge down, Elise. Guest. And walked away. They could keep their crest, their photos, their cropped memories. I had my name. I had my truth. 2 days later, I unlocked my grandmother's old house by the Maine coast. The air smelled of cedar and lemon oil. In the just-in-case drawer beneath candles and rubber bands, I found an envelope with my name in her handwriting, Elise, when the time is right. Inside. They may not remember what you gave, but the house will. Legacy is not who claims you. Legacy is who you care for. That night, I made tea, sat on the porch, and began drafting a residency for women like me, for those cut out of family photos, cut off from inheritances, cut down by silence. Not therapy, not charity. Just space to breathe and reclaim a name no one else can steal. Family is not blood. Family is respect. Family is boundaries. Without those, it's only performance dressed as love. So here's my question to you. Have you ever been erased, yet found the strength to redraw your outline? If yes, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0. Let's talk about it. Because your story matters. And sometimes survival itself is the loudest testimony of all. The ballroom opened onto the patio like a scene rehearsed too many times. White hydrangeas bloomed in perfect spheres as though someone had ordered them straight from a catalog titled, How Families Pretend to Love Each Other. The air carried the scent of champagne mixed with salt water from the bay, and every tablecloth was pressed crisp enough to slice. I walked slowly, deliberately, as if I were stepping onto a set rather than into a celebration. Maybe that's what it really was, an elaborate play in which my role had already been cut. The actors knew their lines. I was the extra who wandered in from the wings, hoping someone might remember my name. At the dessert station, I noticed the crest etched on the glassware. A golden flourish, symmetrical, timeless. Familiar. My own design. The summer after high school, I'd spent nights at the kitchen table sketching symbols for the family foundation. My mother hovered behind me, critiquing every curve. Too soft. Too childish. Try again. When I finally drew something that pleased her, she patted my shoulder as though I were a hired intern. That logo now gleamed on every napkin, every candle holder, every photo booth frame. Not a single guest knew where it came from. I traced the design with my finger on the stem of a wine glass. The cold bit into my skin. Once it had felt like contribution. Tonight it felt like theft. When I reached my assigned place, Table 12, I saw the pattern continue. The tables near the stage glittered with family crests in miniature frames, elegant calligraphy for each member, mother of the bride, father of the bride, sister of the bride. But at my seat, just a white card with my first name in plain font shoved into a plastic holder. No crest, no ribbon, no identity beyond the bare minimum required to feed me dinner. Around me sat strangers, a florist who complained about pollen stains, a retired coach who asked if I was with catering, an older couple who spent half the night mispronouncing my sister's name as if she were a brand of perfume. They didn't ask who I was. They didn't care. And why should they? The family narrative had been rehearsed so carefully that I was no longer in the script. I kept my mouth closed and let my eyes do the work. Silence is an old friend of mine. In this family, silence speaks louder than truth. At the next table, a cluster of women wore matching silk shawls. One nudged the other and whispered, not bothering to lower her voice. "Is that the sister?" The reply came instantly. "No, the sister's already inside. That must be an assistant or something." Their certainty stung more than their words. To them, I wasn't erased, I had never existed. I glanced up at the stage where the welcome board gleamed with script with love from the families of Jolin and Leland. A list of names followed, gilded and proud. I searched for my own. Nothing. Not Kraft. Not Elise. Not even a token courtesy like and family. That omission was no accident. It was clean. Surgical. The kind of precision you see in marketing campaigns where every color, every comma is debated for weeks. I pressed the edge of my name card flat against the table. Its corners cut faintly into my palm. Paper is harmless unless it carries the weight of dismissal. For a moment, I wondered if I was overreacting, if maybe this was just another oversight. Then I remembered last Christmas, the family portrait mailed to donors had mysteriously cropped me out. The scholarship I proposed last fall had been announced under my sister's name. The board newsletter no longer included my bylines. This wasn't accident. This was architecture. The setting itself whispered the truth: I wasn't here to be family. I was here to be background. And backgrounds, unlike people, don't get to speak. But I knew better. Backgrounds also hold the frame together. I sat at table 12, fork untouched, pretending to study the floral arrangement in front of me. White lilies, stiff and perfect, as though someone had pressed them between the pages of a book labeled Elegance. But I wasn't really looking at flowers. I was cataloging the years. At first, erasure had felt like coincidence. A missed email about a charity gala. A newsletter where my name had slipped off the contributors list. A photo where my head was just out of frame, cut off by bad cropping. Small things easy to excuse. But small things pile up. They don't vanish. They form patterns. I remembered the Christmas card 2 winters ago. A glossy print of my parents and my sister, all wrapped in scarlet and gold, standing in front of the tree. I was there that night. I had stood in the same living room, wore the same colors. When the card arrived in the mail, my face had been cropped neatly away, replaced by a glittering edge of tinsel. At the time, I laughed, told myself maybe the editor just needed to balance the shot. Tonight, I knew better. I thought about the scholarship fund. My idea. My proposal. Hours spent drafting the mission statement, outlining the logistics, even calculating budgets. A few months later, a glossy press release arrived in my inbox. The headline credited Jolyn Craft, my sister, as the visionary behind the program. My name wasn't mentioned once. I told myself maybe they forgot to include me, maybe someone in PR just copied the wrong notes. But forgetting is random. This was surgical. And the family newsletter. Once it carried my bylines, regularly updates on projects, reflections on events. I loved writing them, weaving our work into words that reached donors across the country. Then suddenly, my pieces stopped appearing. At first, I thought maybe they were rotating voices, giving others a chance. But the newsletters kept coming full of my sister's words, my mother's voice, my father's updates. Not mine. Never mine again. Sitting in the garden tonight with the crest I had designed etched onto every glass, I realized these weren't isolated mistakes. They were rehearsals. Rehearsals for this very moment when my identity could be erased in full view of hundreds of witnesses, and no one would blink because the groundwork had already been laid. The crowd laughed at some story near the stage. I didn't hear the punchline. My attention snagged on the program booklet at my table. On the back page, a list of acknowledgments printed in neat columns. My sister's name appeared 5 times. My parents 3. Even the fiancé's distant relatives earned a line. I searched the page for mine. There was no Elise, no Craft, nothing. It was then the word slipped into my head, quiet but sharp, intentional. This wasn't about forgetting. Forgetting is messy. Forgetting leaves, traces, half-finished sentences, awkward pauses, vague apologies. What I saw tonight was clean. It was deliberate. It was execution. And it worked. The florist at my table didn't know who I was. The coach thought I belonged to catering. Guests whispered assumptions about me being an assistant. The narrative had been rewritten so thoroughly that even strangers believed it. I pressed my napkin flat against my knees as if the fabric could steady me. My breath came slow. Rage might have been easier, but what I felt was colder. A kind of clarity you only get when you stop asking why and start asking when. When had they decided I didn't belong? Was it gradual like erosion? Or did they choose a date? A meeting? A signature line on some invisible contract? The pattern told me the answer didn't matter. Because the result was the same, I was invisible, and invisibility had been branded as family tradition. But here's the thing about patterns. Once you recognize them, you can predict the next move. And tonight, for the first time, I wasn't just the erased daughter. I was the observer with a ledger. The laughter around me swelled again, but I no longer heard it as celebration. I heard it as proof. Proof that I had stopped existing in their story long before tonight. And that realization wasn't weakness. It was ammunition. The night air shifted when I left my table. I wasn't hungry, not for food anyway. What I wanted was space, a corner where I could breathe without the echo of my sister's laughter bouncing off the chandeliers. The music floated behind me, polite jazz with no soul as I drifted toward the pergola bar tucked beneath vines that seemed too heavy for their trellis. That's when I saw it. A leather briefcase sat on a low cocktail table, half hidden behind an untouched flute of Prosecco. At first, I thought nothing of it, just another accessory abandoned by a guest too busy socializing. But then I noticed the flap was open, the clasp undone, like a mouth left ajar mid-sentence. And peeking out from inside was a folder. Manila ordinary except for the bold black font across the tab Caldwell Trust Holdings. Cape Cod Transfer Authorization. My chest tightened. I knew that font. I had used it myself years ago when I was still the one keeping the books typing late into the night while my family slept. I could have recognized it blindfolded. I leaned closer, careful, as though proximity alone might set off alarms. One sheet jutted just far enough for the name to show. My name. centered typed unmissable Elise Craft, and beneath it my signature. Or rather, the version of my signature someone thought they could replicate. The curl of the E was too tight. The loop in the S was wider than it had any right to be. It was a forgery. Amateur to my eye, but convincing enough for those who didn't know the rhythm of my hand after years of signing documents. They thought they could copy me with a PDF and good intentions. They forgot that signatures aren't just letters. They're muscle memory carved into paper. I didn't panic. I didn't gasp. My hands didn't even shake. Instead, everything inside me slowed like the air had thickened into glass and I was moving carefully through it. Evidence. Cold, undeniable evidence that I hadn't just been erased. I had been replaced. A server passed nearby carrying a tray of champagne. I stepped aside, let him glide past, then shifted my weight casually so no one would notice my eyes fixed on the folder. I didn't touch it. Not yet. Touching would make it theft. Observing was survival. I lowered my gaze to my phone, slid it out of my clutch, and angled the camera as though checking a message. 1 click, 2. The folder, the tab, the forged name, captured, preserved. The air hummed around me. Guests laughed at some anecdote near the fountain. A breeze rustled the vines overhead. And there I stood in the soft amber light holding proof that could unravel everything my parents and sister had built on lies. For a moment, I imagined what would happen if I pulled the folder out, held it aloft, shouted across the garden. Here it is. The proof. Look what they did. Would the guests gasp? Would my parents pale? Would the band stop mid-note? No, I knew better. They'd spin it, dismiss me as dramatic, accuse me of overreacting. That's how image control works. You don't deny. You reframe. So I chose silence. Strategic silence. I slid my phone back into my clutch and straightened slowly. My reflection shimmered faintly in the Prosecco glass beside the briefcase. For once, I didn't see the invisible daughter. I saw someone who finally held leverage. I walked away as though nothing had happened, the music swelling behind me, the scent of salt and sugar thick in the air. To anyone watching, I was just another guest stretching her legs. But inside, I was carrying a weapon sharper than any toast or speech. The folder shouldn't have been there, but it was. And in that mistake, my family had left a door open, and I intended to walk through it. The party pulsed behind me, music swelling glasses, clinking laughter rising like heat from the ballroom. I slipped through a side hallway near the catering station. The carpet muffled my steps. The walls hummed faintly with the vibration of pipes. It was narrow, dim, lined with storage closets and emergency lights. A place designed for staff, not family. Which made it perfect for what came next. She followed me. I didn't even need to look back to know. My sister's heels clicked in steady rhythm, rehearsed like everything else she did. When she caught up, she leaned against the wall glass in hand, her gown glittering faintly under the red glow of the exit sign. You used to have my back. I began my voice low but steady, even when you couldn't say it out loud. Did that stop because I stopped being useful to your image? Her smile was corporate polish, the kind that never reached her eyes. It's not about being useful, Elise. It's about cohesion. Families need cohesion. You've always wanted something different, something that doesn't quite fit. The word clanged in my head, cohesion. I almost laughed. Cohesion, I repeated. Is that what you call deleting people now? She shrugged as though I were a stubborn client refusing to sign a contract. It's not personal. That's the problem, I said. It should have been. For a heartbeat, silence stretched between us. The hallway light flickered once a single stutter of shadow over her face. In that pause, I saw her not as the polished daughter, not as the family's jewel, but as someone hollow and ambition shaped into human form, terrified of cracks. I stepped back not to retreat, but to draw a line. The crest, the foundation, the scholarships, they weren't built by one daughter. You know that. Her smile didn't waver. She didn't argue. She didn't need to. Her silence was confession enough. I turned before she could answer, the sound of my heels soft against the carpet. Behind me, her polished mask remained intact, but I had already peeled it open in my mind. There was nothing left worth debating. In families like mine, truth doesn't scream. It whispers. And tonight, it whispered loud enough for me to hear. If you believe boundaries matter more than forced cohesion, type 1 in the comments. If you think family unity should come at any cost, type 0. Let's see where you stand. The ballroom lights softened into an amber glow, chandeliers dripping like molten gold above the crowd. The musicians shifted tempo strings, weaving through the low notes of a piano, a melody designed to smooth over any tension and wrap the evening in elegance. Guests floated from table to table, wine glasses, raised laughter bubbling as though nothing in the world could crack this polished surface. I kept close to the edges where the lantern light dimmed and shadows gave me cover. I wasn't looking for conversation. I wasn't even looking for food or drink. What I wanted was air, something that didn't taste like perfume and sugar. My gaze drifted across the courtyard through the bodies moving in and out of light, and then it stopped. Because there it was, the necklace. It caught the light in a way no other jewel could, the uneven pearls reflecting in slightly offbeat rhythm. Anyone else might have seen just another strand of ivory beads, elegant, expensive. But I knew better. One bead was always larger, just a fraction left of the clasp. I remembered tracing it with my thumb again and again whenever I needed grounding. I remembered how the thread felt slightly rough at the seam where it had been restrung by hand. My grandmother gave it to me the year I turned 28. We had sat together on the porch of her Bar Harbor house, waves breaking against the rocks below. She'd pressed the velvet box into my hands, and when I opened it, she looked at me with eyes that cut through every layer of pretense. "You see things clearly, Elise," she whispered. "That's rarer than being liked. Keep this as a reminder. It will hold you steady when the rest of the world tries to blur you out." I had held on to those words like scripture. I wore the necklace on days I needed courage, in courtrooms, in meetings, even once during a job interview I knew I didn't want, but couldn't refuse. It wasn't just an accessory. It was proof that someone had seen me fully without edits. Months later, my mother asked to borrow it. She said it needed polishing, that the clasp looked tarnished and would photograph poorly at the upcoming gala. I handed it over, trusting it would come back. It never did. Whenever I asked, she brushed me off with vague promises, "I'll check the jeweler's receipt," or, "Oh, it must still be in storage." Eventually, I stopped asking. The silence between us swallowed that necklace whole. Until tonight. There it was, draped casually across my sister's collarbone, glowing under the chandelier as though it had belonged to her all along. She touched it once, absent-mindedly, while laughing with a circle of donors like it was nothing more than another accessory chosen to complement her gown. My breath hitched. The room felt smaller, the air tighter, as though every chandelier had tilted downward, pressing me into the floor. Of all the insults, of all the omissions, this was the sharpest cut. Because the necklace wasn't about public image or branding or optics. It was about legacy passed quietly, hand to hand. And they had taken it, twisted it into a stage prop, just like they'd twisted everything else. I walked toward her before I had time to debate it. My steps were slow, deliberate, but each one rang in my chest like a drum. She turned as I approached, her smile wide and perfectly practiced. For a split second, her eyes flickered calculation annoyance, but then the mask returned. "Can we talk for a second?" I asked. My voice came out even stronger than I expected. She hesitated just long enough for me to see the hesitation, then tilted her head gracefully. We stepped aside near a pillar wrapped in fairy lights. The music softened behind us, and the crowd kept moving as though nothing had shifted. "That necklace," I said quietly, my gaze fixed on it. "You can wear it. You can polish it. You can pretend it was always yours. But you can't steal what it meant to me." Her lips pressed into a thin smile, the kind that looked elegant in photos but carried no weight. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence between us was thick, heavy with admission. I let the pause stretch long enough to make her uncomfortable. Then I added, "You can erase me from their photos, from the programs, from every donor speech. You can even make strangers believe I was never here. But you can't rewrite the moments that belonged to me. You can't rewrite the promises that were given in private, the ones you were never part of." Her face didn't crack, but her eyes did. For the first time that evening, I saw the faintest fracture in her performance. Not guilt, not regret. Just the fear that comes when someone realizes their illusion might not hold forever. I turned before she could recover, my back straight, my steps steady. Rage burned in my chest, but it wasn't wild anymore. It was focused. Proof had found me once tonight in a folder I wasn't meant to see. And now it burned against my skin again in the form of stolen pearls. They thought they had erased me. But objects remember, legacies remember. And if people can be edited out of stories, then stories can also be rewritten. Have you ever had something deeply meaningful taken from you, an heirloom, a promise, even just credit for your own work? If yes, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0. Let's talk about it. The lights dimmed further, chandeliers softening to a golden hush as servers glided between tables, reminding guests to take their seats again. A hush rippled through the courtyard. Glasses were set down, napkins lifted into laps, voices fading to whispers. At the far end, a projector screen unfurled like a curtain announcing the next act. Please enjoy a special look back at Jolin's journey. The MC said, his tone syrup smooth. Applause followed, polite and expectant. Then the first image bloomed onto the screen. A 3-year-old girl in frosting-stained pajamas, cheeks, round eyes, bright a paper party hat sliding off her head. The crowd laughed warmly. Another image replaced it, a ballet recital. A tiny body in pink tulle arms, stiff but hopeful. Applause again, cooing admiration from relatives I barely recognized. And I knew these images. Not because I had seen them before, but because I had arranged them. 4 years ago, I spent weeks sifting through dusty albums, splicing together tapes from VHS, digitizing old footage frame by frame. It was supposed to be a private anniversary gift for my parents, something intimate, too raw for public use. I spent nights adjusting transitions, layering piano over the scratchy audio, crafting the rhythm so the memories would flow like a hymn. My mother told me afterward it was too personal to share. She tucked it away, promised it was only for us. Yet here it was, projected larger than life, rebranded as Jolin's story. I sat still at the edge of the courtyard, my hands folded in my lap. The audience gasped at the ballet clips, teared up when an image of our grandmother filled the screen flower on her apron sleeves, rolled as she leaned over a pie crust. A memory I captured, not my sister. A shot I chose, not her. Every frame screamed my fingerprints, the timing of the dissolves, the warmth of the color grading, even the way the captions curved in gold serif against black. That was my work. My gift. My name invisible. And still I did not move. Because invisibility had taught me something: patience. If you wait long enough, truth has a way of bleeding through even the thickest filters. Halfway through the montage, the applause softened into sighs. My sister's voice came in through a pre-recorded narration, charming, rehearsed, dripping with gratitude. "Family is our legacy," she intoned. "Every moment shaped me into who I am today." The guests nodded, enchanted. My parents clasped hands, radiant in the front row. I stared at the pearls around her neck, glowing against her skin, and whispered under my breath, "Legacy isn't built on theft." Then, without warning, the slideshow faltered. A frame froze mid-laugh, jittered, then dissolved into a different image. Not one they had planned to show. It was a picnic nearly 15 years old. I remembered it vividly, the humidity, the folding tables, the straw hat my grandmother always insisted I wear. In the cropped version, only my sister and parents appeared neat and central. But on the screen now, unedited, I was there. Mid-laugh plate in hand, sunlight catching the brim of that ridiculous hat. The crowd murmured. Forks paused midair. I heard someone whisper, "Wait, wasn't she edited out of that one?" Another voice responded, "That's the original." I remember. She helped organize that whole event. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The smallest crack had appeared in the perfect glass surface. The montage kept rolling, but the air had shifted. Guests leaned in closer, not for nostalgia, but for hints, searching for other edits, other absences. My sister's narration stumbled for half a second as though she too had noticed the glitch. My mother dabbed her eyes harder than necessary, overacting the emotion to redirect the room. But it was too late. The whisper had already begun its quiet spread. I stayed seated, hands steady. I didn't need to stand. I didn't need to shout, "That's mine, I made that." The truth had shown itself uninvited, undeniable. Because sometimes evidence doesn't live in folders or forged signatures. Sometimes it lives in the unedited frame. I let my gaze drift to the photographer at the side of the courtyard. His lens was fixed on the stage, on my sister, on the parents, basking in light. He hadn't turned toward me once all night. Still, I wondered if his memory carried the same uncropped images, if his archives held versions they had long tried to bury. I whispered again, quieter this time. Erase me all you want. The original still exists. And for the first time that evening, I didn't feel invisible. I felt inevitable. The projector dimmed after the montage ended the courtyard filling with scattered applause. But it wasn't the same applause as before. It felt thinner, less certain, as if some guests were clapping only because they thought they were supposed to. And in between those polite bursts of noise, I caught something else murmurs. They were faint at first, like the rustle of silk dresses brushing against chair legs. But once I tuned in, I could hear them clearly. Didn't Elise put that fundraiser together? A woman near the aisle whispered to her husband. I thought so. I remember seeing her at the sign-in table that year, he replied, his brows furrowing. Another voice carried from 2 tables away. The slideshow. Wasn't that video one of Elise's projects? She used to handle all the archiving. The words threaded through the air like cracks spreading across glass. My sister smiled tightly on stage, bowing her head as if absorbing praise, but I saw her jaw tighten. She heard it too. The staff moved quickly to distract, rolling out trays of petit fours and champagne refills. The band picked up a lighter tune, something breezy and forgettable. But whispers don't obey music. They keep spreading. I sat still, sipping water I hadn't touched all night, letting my presence do the work. Because in families like mine, silence was often mistaken for weakness. Tonight, silence was strategy. From the corner of my eye, I caught the retired board member, Mr. Ellis, leaning toward his wife. His voice wasn't quiet enough. I'm almost certain Elise designed the first crest when the foundation started. Do they really not mention her anymore? His wife nodded slowly, her expression tight. I remember those meetings. She was always there. My chest tightened, but not with pain this time. With confirmation. Even the staff noticed. A young server paused at my table to pour more water. His hand shook slightly, not from clumsiness, but from nerves. When he leaned down, his voice dropped low, almost conspiratorial. Ma'am, I just wanted to say, the layout tonight, the flower pairings, the lighting, it's different. Cleaner. Feels like someone actually cared about it. His eyes flicked toward me, then away. I heard you helped design the plan. If that's true, well, it shows. He straightened quickly, disappearing before I could reply. But his words landed heavier than any toast. Recognition from someone who wasn't playing politics. Someone who had simply noticed the fingerprints I'd left behind. It was small, maybe even trivial to others, but to me it was oxygen. For years, every trace of my effort had been scrubbed, painted over, handed to someone else. Now, here in whispers and nods, pieces of my truth were resurfacing. Not shouted, not demanded, just remembered. And memories are harder to erase than photographs. Across the courtyard, I spotted my cousin Maureen watching me. She sat 2 tables over her body, angled toward the stage, but her eyes flickered my way. When they met mine, she gave a nod, small, almost reluctant. Then she turned back quickly as though the gesture itself was risky. Still, it was enough. In a family built on silence, even the smallest acknowledgement was rebellion. The air shifted. Guests adjusted in their seats. The cracks were widening, not with drama, but with recognition. Recognition spreads faster than denial because it requires no defense. It just waits patient until enough people quietly agree, yes. I remember that too. I didn't smile. I didn't move. Outwardly, I was still the quiet sister tucked in the shadows. Inwardly, I was no longer invisible. For the first time in years, I was becoming undeniable, and that realization was more intoxicating than any champagne they could pour. The whispers were still moving through the courtyard when I reached into my clutch. My fingers brushed against the velvet lining until they found what I had been carrying all evening, a red envelope. Thicker than any invitation, heavier than any thank you card. I'd prepared it weeks ago, long before tonight. Call it intuition, call it survival, but some part of me had known the truth would demand more than memory. Inside the envelope lay copies of documents, timestamps, metadata, and most importantly, the photograph I had taken of the trust transfer folder. Evidence doesn't shout, it waits for the right moment. That moment had arrived. I scanned the crowd until my gaze landed on him. Mr. Rosenuncle to Leland the fiancé. He was the kind of man who looked perpetually unimpressed, the kind of man who read contracts twice before signing. He was also crucially the one who advised on legal matters for Leland's family. I rose from my chair slowly, careful not to draw attention. My steps were measured, threading through the pockets of chatter and clinking glasses until I reached his table. He noticed me before I spoke, his eyes narrowing slightly as though trying to place me. "Mr. Rosen," I said quietly, my voice even. I held out the envelope. "This should reach your desk before Monday. It concerns the Caldwell Trust. I believe you'll find irregularities." He looked at the envelope, then at me, his expression tightening as he read the label written across the back in neat black ink, "Caldwell Trust Transfer. Supporting documentation enclosed." For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Around us, the party continued applause at some joke, the faint trill of the piano glasses raised in glittering celebration. But in that pocket of silence, a transaction heavier than any toast took place. He accepted the envelope without a word. His hand was steady, but I saw the flicker in his eyes, recognition that this wasn't trivial. Recognition that it carried weight. He slid the envelope under his chair, discreet as if it were nothing more than a napkin. I didn't explain further. I didn't plead for him to believe me. I didn't demand acknowledgement. The evidence would speak for itself when the time came. As I walked back toward my table, I felt a calmness settle over me. Not triumph, calmness. Because power doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from choosing the right witness, placing the right proof in the right hands, and walking away before anyone realizes what just shifted. Back at my seat, I picked up my glass of water. It was still full untouched. I raised it slowly, not in a toast, but in a silent acknowledgement to myself. This wasn't about being seen anymore. This was about being documented. From across the courtyard, I caught my sister's eye. She was laughing at something one of the donors said, her smile wide and sparkling. But for the first time, I didn't feel cut by it. Because I knew something she didn't. I knew the first domino had already tipped, and by the time she noticed the fall would be irreversible. They had built their empire on curated images, on cropped photos, on applause lines crafted for donors. But documents don't care about performance. Documents don't applaud. Documents endure. And now the documents were no longer theirs to control. Do you believe quiet actions like handing over evidence can sometimes be more powerful than loud confrontations? If yes, type 1. If not, type 0. Let's see where you stand. The projector whirred back to life. Guests settled into their chairs, balancing plates of petit fours and half-drained champagne flutes. The MC, flustered from the earlier glitch, tried to recover with a bright smile. "We'll just pick up where we left off. Please enjoy the rest of this special tribute." But something had shifted. The applause was muted, the air taut. People weren't leaning in for nostalgia anymore. They were waiting, curious, cautious, almost suspicious. The slideshow began again. At first, the images returned to the polished rhythm ballet recitals, charity galas, graduations. My sister's life framed as a flawless trajectory. The music swelled, the transitions gleamed. And yet the room didn't relax. The earlier glitch had left a crack in the illusion. Now everyone was watching too closely. Then it happened. A transition stuttered, froze, then bled into an image that wasn't supposed to be there. The photo filled the screen, a summer fundraiser in Bar Harbor. Humidity blurred the edges, folding chairs lined the background, lemonade too sweet to drink sat on the tables. I remembered the moment exactly because I had organized half of it. And there I was, standing at the far left clipboard in hand straw hat tipping awkwardly over my face, laughing mid-sentence. The audience murmured instantly. It wasn't the warm laughter they'd offered earlier. This was sharper questioning. "Wait, wasn't this photo cropped in the newsletter?" someone whispered. "I thought she wasn't there that day," another voice replied. "No, I remember. She was the one checking in donors." The whispers grew louder, overlapping threads weaving together into recognition. The slideshow tried to continue, but the machine sputtered again as if reluctant to uphold the lie. Another image flickered into place. Thanksgiving dinner, a long table groaning under the weight of casseroles and pies. My parents smiling proudly, my sister glowing at the center. And me, fully visible, seated 2 chairs down, caught mid-reach for the gravy boat. In the version mailed to donors, I had been erased. In this one, I was undeniable. I watched the guests shift in their seats, their certainty unraveling. Forks clinked against plates, not in appetite, but in distraction. A man near the stage whispered too loudly. "They said she wasn't at that dinner. That's her right there." His wife nodded, eyes narrowing at the screen. At the front row, my mother's smile faltered. She leaned toward my father, whispering something urgent. He kept his face neutral, but his hand tightened against his knee the way it always did when the mask threatened to slip. And my sister, she sat still, perfectly poised, her face trained into serenity. But her eyes betrayed her. They darted toward me, quick, sharp, calculating. Not a glance of dismissal anymore. A glance of warning. She knew the illusion was slipping. The slideshow continued limping now, each frame another risk. I didn't need to intervene. The evidence was doing the work for me. Because when truth resurfaces, it doesn't need a narrator. It needs only silence, and silence was the one thing my family could no longer control. I sat back, folding my hands in my lap, letting the images roll. I wasn't fighting to be recognized anymore. Recognition was happening all around me in gasps and murmurs, in the sudden way people began to look at me with new eyes. I whispered to myself so softly no one else could hear, "Erase me if you must." But the archive remembers. And for the first time in years, I felt the weight shift. Not all the way, not yet. But enough to know the tide had turned. The slideshow sputtered to its awkward end, the final frame freezing on my sister's radiant smile before fading to black. The lights brightened slowly like dawn after a storm. Guests shifted in their seats, murmurs swirling across the courtyard like restless birds. The air had changed. It was no longer celebratory. It was suspicious, heavy with questions no one dared to voice aloud. I stayed where I was, still at the edge of the courtyard, water glass untouched. My gaze drifted toward the head table where my sister sat, Pearl's glowing smile fixed in place. She looked flawless, poised, untouchable, except for the tension in her shoulders, the faint twitch in her jaw. Even the best performers strain under the weight of a collapsing stage. Then he stood. Leland, her fiancé, rose slowly from his chair. He didn't gesture for attention. He didn't clear his throat or raise his hand. He simply stood and the room went quiet. Stillness settled like dust. Every head turned, not because he demanded it, but because the timing felt undeniable. "I've been listening." He began, his voice steady, resonant enough to carry across the courtyard. "And I've been watching." He glanced briefly toward the projector, then toward me, his eyes sharp, clear. "I've also been reading." His words landed like a stone tossed into still water. The ripples spread instantly. Guests leaned forward. My sister stiffened. My parents froze, their smiles locked in place like masks glued too tight. "I've heard this family talk tonight about legacy." He continued, about tradition, about image, but what I've seen, what we've all seen, tells a different story. Not one of legacy, one of control. Image control dressed up as family values. A murmur swept through the tables. My sister's face remained composed, but her hand tightened around her wine glass. "You erased your own daughter," he said, voice calm but sharp enough to cut. "You edited her out of photos, programs, newsletters, out of everything. You assumed no one would ask that. No one would notice, that she herself wouldn't fight back. But you were wrong. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was electric." Leland looked down at his left hand. For a moment, the courtyard was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the projector cooling the distant rustle of lanterns in the breeze. Then he twisted the engagement ring from his finger. Slowly, deliberately, he placed it on the white linen tablecloth in front of my sister. This marriage, he said, softer now but no less certain, would have been built on silence. On erasure. On someone else's pain. I'm not comfortable building my future on that. He stepped back from the table. He didn't look at her again. He didn't look at my parents. He simply turned and walked out, each step echoing louder than any music could. No one clapped. No one gasped. No one moved. The courtyard was frozen, as though the entire evening had been holding its breath and finally realized there was no exhale coming. My sister sat perfectly still, her smile gone, her eyes fixed on the door he had just walked through. She didn't chase him. She didn't cry. She just stared, as if waiting for someone else to reset the scene, to smooth over the fracture. But no one did. The band faltered, strings wobbling before collapsing into silence. One of the servers dropped a stack of cocktail napkins in the corner, the sound sharp and graceless. It was the only noise, and it didn't belong to the script my family had written. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Because for the first time, the cost of their performance was visible to everyone. Not just in whispers, not just in glitches, but in the ring that sat gleaming on the table, abandoned, undeniable. And in that silence, I realized something image can be curated, controlled, cropped. But integrity. Integrity walks away when you least expect it, and it takes everything with it. The party didn't collapse in a single moment after Leland placed the ring on the table. It sagged like a structure whose beams had cracked but still stood upright out of habit. People returned to their plates, but no one tasted their food. The musicians plucked a few tentative notes, then stopped as if even they no longer believed in the music. The chatter that rose up wasn't celebration anymore. It was survival. A desperate attempt to patch over silence with words that meant nothing. I stayed seated at table 12, the furthest corner of the courtyard where the shadows lingered. The exile table, I thought. My place had always been here, whether literally or metaphorically, close enough to be useful, far enough to be forgotten. The badge on my chest weighed more than pearls ever could. I unpinned it slowly, fingers brushing against the cheap plastic. Elise. Guest. Just 6 letters and 1 word, but together they carried the entire verdict my family had written for me. I turned it over in my hand, letting the lantern light reflect across its surface. A guest is temporary, interchangeable. A guest has no stake in the story. No claim to the house, no right to protest when the hosts change the rules. That was how they wanted me to exist here, but not hear acknowledged just enough to silence questions. The absurdity struck me like sudden laughter in church. After years of meticulously scrubbing me from newsletters, photos, speeches, they thought this badge was the finishing touch. A tiny rectangle, plastic and ink, as though my entire identity could be shrunk down and filed under other. The longer I stared at it, the less it burned. In fact, it became ridiculous. A crest can be etched in gold, photos can be cropped. Names can be deleted, but my grandmother hadn't handed me her necklace because I was a guest. She had handed it to me because I belonged. She knew that. I knew that. And no badge could unwrite it. I stood. The chair scraped faintly against the stone, a sound louder than I expected in the muted courtyard. A few heads turned eyes following me cautiously, but no one spoke. No one asked where I was going. That silence was its own truth. They never expected me to stay, only to absorb humiliation quietly. I walked slowly across the courtyard. The projector still hummed behind me, the screen blank now, like a stage that had lost its play. The dessert tables stood untouched eclairs, collapsing under their own weight, sugared fruit drying in the warm air. Guests shifted awkwardly, pretending not to notice me moving toward the gate. At the stone entrance, I paused. The night air was cooler here, sharper, carrying the scent of saltwater from the bay. For the first time all evening, I felt my lungs expand fully. I looked down at the badge one last time. Guest. I set it on the stone ledge, face up, where the lantern glow caught its edges. The breeze lifted slightly, rattling it against the surface, a flimsy sound that matched its meaning. I didn't crush it. Didn't tear it. Destruction wasn't necessary. Leaving it behind was louder than any dramatic gesture, because walking away is sometimes the sharpest form of defiance. It says you don't get to define me. You don't get to keep me. I choose to leave you behind. The courtyard noises faded as I stepped into the gravel path. My shoes crunched steadily, a rhythm that belonged only to me. With each step, the performance shrank. The lies shrank, the family crest shrank, until all that remained was my breath and the dark sky above. I whispered barely louder than the tide, they can keep the crest. I keep my name. And in that moment, it didn't feel like defeat. It felt like reclamation. The drive north took 2 days. I didn't rush. There was no point in racing after a life I had already stepped out of. I stopped in small towns with diners that smelled of coffee and fried dough, stayed at roadside inns where the sheets smelled faintly of bleach. For once, the map mattered more than the clock. Every mile put distance between me and the performance I had just abandoned. By the time I reached the coast of Maine, the sky was sinking into dusk. The house stood quiet on its hill shutters drawn like folded hands, the roofline dark against the orange horizon. No lights burned in the windows. No welcome committee waited at the door. And that was exactly what I needed: silence that wasn't punishment, but refuge. The key slid into the lock easily, though I hadn't touched it in years. My hand remembered the motion as if my body had been rehearsing this return all along. When the door opened, the air smelled of cedar and dust, but also lemon oil. My grandmother's scent, faint but stubborn, clinging to the wood as if refusing to leave. I walked room to room, turning on lamps instead of overhead lights. Lamps glow, they don't announce. The rug swallowed the sound of my steps' familiar patterns, guiding me through spaces I knew by memory. The kitchen still held the same chipped tile along the counter, the same drawer on the left that my grandmother always called her just-in-case drawer. I opened it out of habit. Rubber bands, a half-burnt candle, faded receipts, a flashlight. And beneath it all, folded linens. Tucked between them was an envelope, the paper yellowing at the edges, my name written across the front in her unmistakable script: Elise, when the time is right. I sat at the old kitchen table before opening it, my fingers brushing the grooves carved into the wood by years of dinners and crossword puzzles. I unfolded the letter slowly, as though it might crumble if I hurried. The ink had faded slightly, but her words were steady. They may not remember what you gave, but the house will. You were always the one who stayed after others left. This place is yours not because of a name, but because of your care. That's the only legacy that matters. I didn't cry. Not because I didn't want to, but because the letter didn't invite grief. It invited clarity. It was proof that at least one person in my bloodline had seen me not as a guest, not as a placeholder, not as an error to crop out, but as someone who belonged. I folded the letter gently and placed it beside an old photograph I found tucked into a crossword book on the counter. My grandmother in a wide-brimmed hat, me in cut-off jeans, both of us holding iced tea as though it were holy water. No one else in the frame. Just us. Just enough. That night I didn't unpack. I brewed tea, sat on the porch, and listened to the tide roll in under the moonlight. The air was crisp, salted alive. The silence here wasn't the heavy, punishing kind I'd known at family tables. It was generous, expansive, a silence that gave instead of taking. I looked at the house behind me, the wood glowing faintly under porch light, and whispered, "You remembered. That's enough." The badge I'd left behind at the stone gate was meaningless now. Here I didn't need a title to prove my place. The walls themselves carried my grandmother's handwriting, her recipes still tucked in cookbooks, her voice folded into every corner. This house remembered what they had tried to erase. And in its remembering, it gave me back pieces of myself I thought were gone forever. Have you ever returned to a place or found an object that reminded you of who you really are after others tried to erase you? If yes, type 1. If not, type 0. I'd love to hear your story. The house had always been more than wood and windows. My grandmother used to say, "Walls remember the hands that built them." In the first week I spent back under its roof, I finally understood what she meant. Every floorboard creaked in a familiar tone. Every lamp glowed softer than I remembered, as though the house itself was relieved to have me back. At first, I let the silence hold me. I rose early, made tea, and sat on the porch watching gulls slice the sky above the bay. The rhythm of the tide was steadier than any family I had known, coming, going, retreating, returning without apology. My life until then had been measured in events, in programs, in dinners that blurred together. Here, the only measure was the way the sunlight shifted across the worn wood floors. But silence doesn't stay empty forever. It asks you questions. What now? What next? Who will you be once the noise has stopped? The answer came one evening at the kitchen table, where I still kept my grandmother's letter folded neatly in its envelope. This place is yours, not because of a name, but because of your care. I ran my thumb over the words until the ink smudged faintly, and I realized the house was never meant to be a museum for my grief. It was meant to live. I opened my laptop and began to type. Not an essay, not another desperate explanation to people unwilling to listen. A proposal. A seed. The title was simple: The Bar Harbor Residency Project. The idea was clearer than I expected: short-term residencies for women who had been cut off by their families by choice or by cruelty. A place to pause, to breathe, to remember their own names before someone else rewrote them. Not therapy, not charity, just shelter, just space. My fingers flew. Rooms, Private common spaces, optional. Silence respected. Meals offered but not required. No photos, no performance. Nothing asked of you but your presence. When I finished, I sat back, heart racing. For the first time in years, I had written something that didn't beg for acknowledgement. It simply existed, whole, valid mine. I sent the draft to a friend in Vermont who ran a small nonprofit. By the time I woke the next morning, her reply waited in my inbox. Absolutely. We'll co-fund the pilot. Let's get this off the ground by fall. The transformation began quietly. I opened shutters that hadn't seen light in years. I washed sheets and quilt covers, each one smelling faintly of cedar after hours in the sun. I painted the shutters a deep sea-worn blue, the kind my grandmother loved. Volunteers came, friends of friends, neighbors curious but kind. They didn't ask about Savannah or scandals or engagement parties. They only asked, "What do you want this place to be?" And I answered somewhere, and no one has to apologize for existing. By late September, the first guests arrived. I remember the way they clutched their duffel bags, shoulders tight, as if bracing for interrogation. One apologized 3 times before she even crossed the threshold for being late, for bringing too much luggage, for taking up space. Another asked, almost in a whisper, "Do I have to prove anything to stay?" I told them no. That night, we sat on the porch together, 3 strangers wrapped in the smell of salt air and pine. I poured tea into mismatched mugs, the same ones my grandmother had collected from thrift shops. We didn't share stories. We didn't need to. The silence was not the sharp kind. I'd grown up with the silence that punished. This was generous silence, the kind that says you can be here without performing. As the lanterns flickered, one of the women asked softly, "So, who built this place?" I smiled, looking back at the glowing windows, the walls that had held generations of both love and betrayal. They don't ask who built the house. I whispered to myself later when I was alone in the writing room. They just thanked the one who opened the door. On the wall hung my grandmother's photograph, her hat tilted against the sun, her smile unguarded. For the first time in years, I felt her legacy not in crests, not in staged photographs, not in polished speeches. In care, in continuity, in survival turned into shelter. The irony was sharp, almost funny. My family erased me to polish their own image, but the erasure had left me with something they could never control the freedom to create. They thought they'd silenced me, but silence turned out to be the foundation for something new. And as I watched the women settle into their rooms that night, I knew this house was no longer just mine. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told they were a guest in their own life. Do you think true healing comes from creating something new out of the pain, rather than waiting for old wounds to close on their own? If yes, type 1. If not, type 0. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Autumn came quickly to Bar Harbor. The air turned sharper. The trees caught fire in red and gold, and the tide rolled in colder each evening. By then, the residency house had welcomed its first circle of guests. Some stayed a week, some longer, all arriving with the same nervous posture of people who had been told too often they were too much or not enough. One evening, as the wind rattled the shutters and the smell of wood smoke drifted from a neighbor's chimney, we gathered in the living room. The fire crackled uneven but warm. No one was forced to share, but sometimes silence loosens what words cannot. A young woman, barely 20, spoke first. Her parents had cut her off when she refused to follow the family business. She laughed bitterly as she said it, but the sound cracked halfway through. Another woman admitted she hadn't heard her own name spoken kindly in months. A third confessed she had carried her grandmother's scarf in her bag, terrified her family would take it if they knew. I listened. Not as a director, not as a host, just as someone who understood. And when the silence returned thick but not punishing, they looked at me, waiting. Not for answers, but for something steady enough to hold on to. I drew in a breath and spoke words that had lived inside me for years. Words I had once whispered to an empty courtyard while my sister called herself the only daughter. Family is not blood. I said, my voice calm, clear. The firelight flickered against their faces. It is respect. It is boundaries. Without those, family is only a cage that calls itself love. The words hung in the air, sharp and certain. No applause followed, no speeches, no corrections. Just quiet agreement, the kind that seeps deeper than cheers. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Cutting ties doesn't make you cruel. It makes you free. Walking away isn't betrayal. It's survival. And sometimes it's the only way back to yourself. The women nodded, some with tears, some with relief, some with the kind of stillness that comes only when you finally hear your own truth spoken aloud by someone else. Outside, the wind howled against the shutters. Inside, the silence shifted again, no longer heavy, no longer sharp. It was solidarity. A silence filled with presence, with witness, with something that looked like healing. Later that night, after everyone had drifted off to their rooms, I stood alone on the porch. The tide was silver in the moonlight, endless, patient. I thought of the crest etched on wine glasses back in Savannah, of the slideshow that had glitched into truth, of the badge that called me guest. And I smiled, because none of it mattered anymore. I had my grandmother's letter. I had this house. I had my name. And now I had a new kind of family, not bound by blood, but by respect, by boundaries, by choice. I whispered into the night, not to my parents, not to my sister, but to myself. They can keep their stage. I choose my sanctuary. The tide answered, steady as always. And with that, the story I had once begged them to tell finally became my own. Have you ever discovered that family isn't about blood, but about who respects you and protects your boundaries? If yes, type 1. If you still believe family is only about blood, type 0. Let's have this conversation. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next journey, because the next story might be yours.